Sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest burdens. Sometimes a child's tears can break open even the most guarded heart. In Socorro, New Mexico Territory, 1887, Jeremiah Jed Thornton was fixing his horse's bridle when a little girl tugged at his coat. She was maybe 6 years old, covered in dust and tears. Her dress was torn and her feet were bleeding. "Mister, please follow me home," she whispered. "Mama won't wake up." This little girl reminded Jed of painful memories from 20 years ago when he was still a lawman. Back then, he lost his own family to violence. Now he lived alone, trying to forget the past. But how could he turn away from a child who needed help? What would he find when he followed this desperate little girl across the desert to her home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Socorro. It hung in the air like old grief, coating everything with the color of forgotten dreams. Jeremiah Jed Thornton had grown accustomed to the taste of it on his tongue, the way it clung to his weathered hands, and settled into the creases around his eyes. At 53, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that sudden movements could bring sudden pain. His ranch sat 5 miles outside town, a modest spread with a small adobe house, a barn that had seen better decades, and enough grazing land for the 20 head of cattle that comprised his entire world. The morning routine never varied. Coffee black as midnight, a handful of biscuits left over from the day before, and the slow walk to the corral where his mare, Constance, waited with the patient wisdom of an old friend. Constance had been with him for 8 years now, since he'd given up the badge and the burden that came with it. She was a steady buckskin with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition that matched his need for quiet companionship. Like him, she seemed to understand that some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to carry their weight differently. The ride into Socorro took him past the Martinez homestead, where Rosa Martinez always waved from her kitchen window, and the old Sinclair place, abandoned now for 3 years since the drought took their hope along with their crops. These landmarks had become the boundaries of his carefully constructed world, predictable, manageable, safe. Socorro itself was a town caught between ambition and acceptance. The railroad had brought promises of prosperity that never quite materialized, leaving behind a collection of adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and the kind of people who understood that sometimes staying put was its own form of courage. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, punctuated by Vicente's Cantina, Henderson's medical practice, the general store run by the Kowalski family, and the church, where Father Miguel held services in both Spanish and English for a congregation that needed all the help it could get. Doc Henderson had been Jed's closest thing to a friend these past years, though their relationship consisted mainly of shared silence over checkers and the occasional bottle of whiskey when the memories pressed too hard. Henderson was a rail-thin man in his 60s with hands that never stopped moving and eyes that had seen too much of what people could do to each other. He'd been the one to patch Jed up after the shooting that ended his career as sheriff, and he'd never asked questions about the nightmares that followed. Vicente Morales ran the cantina with the easy authority of a man who understood that sometimes people needed a place to sit with their troubles without having to explain them. His establishment served the best green chili stew in the territory and asked no questions about a man's past or his reasons for drinking alone. Vicente had been born in Socorro and planned to die there, and he treated the town's residents with the gentle tolerance of someone who knew that everyone carried invisible scars. It was in Vicente's place that Jed had first heard the stories about Blackjack Morrison. The name had drifted through conversations like smoke, accompanied by lowered voices and worried glances. Morrison was said to be working the territory again, hitting small banks and way stations with a crew that changed faces more often than the desert changed colors. Some said he'd gone soft, others that he'd gotten meaner with age. All agreed that he was trouble, better avoided. Jed kept a tarnished sheriff's badge buried deep in his saddlebags, wrapped in an old piece of cloth that had once been part of Catherine's wedding dress. He told himself he kept it as a reminder of why he'd quit, but the truth was more complicated. The badge represented 22 years of believing that justice and law were the same thing, that a good man with a gun could make the world safer for people who deserved protection. Catherine Thornton had believed in that man, had married him when he was young and righteous, and certain that the world could be fixed with enough determination and courage. She'd been a schoolteacher with laugh, lines around her green eyes and hands that could gentle a spooked horse or comfort a crying child with equal skill. Their daughter Sarah had inherited her mother's gentle spirit and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that made her fearless in the way that children can be when they believe their parents can protect them from anything. The Apaches had taken them on a Tuesday in March 1867. Jed had been trailing cattle thieves near the Mogollon Rim when the raiding party hit the ranch. He'd found them 3 days later when the vultures led him home. Catherine had been shot trying to shield Sarah, who had been no more than 4 years old. The raiders had taken nothing of value, no horses, no cattle, no supplies. It had been killing for the sake of killing, the kind of random violence that shattered a man's faith in the order of things. After the funerals, Jed had thrown himself into his work with the fury of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He'd tracked down the Apache band responsible and participated in the brutal retribution that followed. He'd worn his badge like armor and his gun like a prayer, believing that if he could just catch enough bad men, arrest enough troublemakers, restore enough order, he might somehow balance the scales that had been tipped so violently against him. It had taken 15 years to realize that justice was not the same as healing, that revenge was not the same as peace. The realization had come during a shootout with a cattle rustler named Jimmy Valdez, a boy barely out of his teens who had been stealing cows to feed his younger siblings. Jed had put 3 bullets in Jimmy's chest and watched the light fade from eyes that reminded him of Sarah's. That night, he'd pinned his badge to Henderson's bar and walked away from the only life he'd known since Catherine's death. The people of Socorro had tried to talk him out of it. He'd been a good sheriff, fair and honest and brave, but Jed had been done with the weight of other people's expectations and his own impossible standards. The years since had passed in a haze of routine and careful isolation. He'd bought the small ranch with money saved from his sheriff's wages and built a life that required nothing from anyone. He raised enough cattle to pay his bills, grew enough vegetables to feed himself, and spoke to people only when commerce or courtesy demanded it. It was not happiness, but it was peace of a sort, and peace had seemed like enough until this morning when small hands had tugged at his coat and a child's voice had cracked open the careful shell he'd built around his heart. Now, standing in Vicente's cantina with the taste of dust and memory thick in his throat, Jed tried to focus on the simple task of buying supplies. He needed coffee, flour, and lamp oil, basic necessities for a basic life, but the child's words echoed in his mind like a prayer he'd forgotten how to answer. "Mama won't wake up." Vicente poured him a whiskey without being asked, sliding the glass across the scarred wood bar with the practiced ease of a man who recognized trouble when it walked through his door. "You look like you've seen a ghost, amigo," Vicente said, his voice carrying the gentle concern of an old friend. Jed stared into the amber liquid, seeing reflections of choices he wasn't ready to make. Outside, the child waited somewhere in the dust and heat, carrying burdens too heavy for her small shoulders. Inside, the whiskey promised the same numbness that had carried him through 7 years of careful solitude. But sometimes he was beginning to understand. The hardest choice was not between right and wrong, but between safety and courage, between the peace of isolation and the terrible responsibility of caring about someone else's pain. The whiskey sat untouched as Jed walked back into the burning light of the New Mexico sun, where a 6-year-old girl with bleeding feet and desperate eyes waited to lead him back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. The little girl stood exactly where he'd left her, clutching a wooden doll that had seen better days. One of the doll's arms was missing, and its painted face had worn away until only the suggestion of features remained. She held it against her, just like a talisman, her small fingers white with the effort of keeping it safe. "What's your name?" Jed asked, kneeling down to meet her eyes. Up close he could see that she was even younger than he'd first thought. 5, maybe 6 at the most. Her hair was the color of wheat straw, tangled and matted with dust, and her blue eyes held a depth of sadness that no child should carry. "Amelia," she whispered, and then, as if remembering her manners, "Amelia Morrison." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Morrison. It couldn't be coincidence. There weren't that many families with that name in the territory, and certainly not many living in the kind of isolation that would explain this child's condition. "Your papa. What's his name?" "Amelia." Her face crumpled slightly. "He went away. Mama said he'd come back, but he's been gone a long time. Mama got sick and she won't wake up, and Tommy and Samuel are gone, and I don't know where they went, and the..." Words tumbled out in a rush, each one carving another piece out of Jed's carefully constructed armor. He held up a gentle hand to slow her down. "It's all right, little one. We'll figure this out. How far is your home?" She pointed toward the desert, where the heat shimmers made the horizon dance like water, past the big rocks that looked like sleeping giants. "Mama always said to follow the dry creek until it bends, then follow the bend until you see our house." Jed knew the area she was describing. Rough country, good for hiding, but hell on anyone trying to scratch out a living. It would be at least an hour's ride, maybe more with a child. He looked at Amelia's bleeding feet and made his decision. "Can you ride a horse?" She nodded solemnly. "Papa taught me before he went away." Within minutes, Jed had Amelia settled in front of him on Constance's back, her small body fitting easily in the circle of his arms. She smelled like desert dust, an unwashed child, with an underlying sweetness that reminded him painfully of Sarah at that age. The wooden doll remained clutched in her arms, a one-armed guardian that seemed to give her comfort. They rode in relative silence, broken only by Amelia's occasional directions and the soft comments she made to her doll. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered to the worn toy. "The nice man is helping us find Mama." The landscape around them told a story of hardship and endurance. The drought had been hard on the territory, leaving creek beds cracked and empty, vegetation sparse and brittle. The rock formations Amelia had mentioned rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments, carved by wind and time into shapes that could indeed be sleeping giants to a child's imagination. As they traveled, Amelia began to open up, her natural child's curiosity overcoming her exhaustion and fear. She pointed out landmarks with the serious attention of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. "That's where Papa shot the rattlesnake that tried to bite Tommy," she said, indicating a cluster of boulders. "And over there is where Mama found the pretty rocks she liked to collect." Each story painted a picture of a family that had once functioned, that had shared moments of protection and joy before whatever darkness had torn them apart. Jed found himself listening not just to the words, but to the longing behind them, the desperate need of a child to believe that the good times could somehow return. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was a testament to broken dreams. The adobe house sat in a depression between two low hills, its walls cracked and crumbling in places where the mud mortar had failed. A few scraggly chickens pecked at the hard-packed dirt around the front door, and a milk cow stood in the meager shade of a stunted cottonwood, her ribs showing through her hide. But it was the silence that struck Jed most forcefully. This should have been the time of day when children's voices carried on the desert air, when the sounds of daily life, cooking, cleaning, the simple business of survival, created the background music of a functioning household. Instead there, was only the whisper of wind through cracked walls and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Amelia slipped down from the horse before Jed could help her, her small feet hitting the ground with a sound like a sigh. She ran toward the house with the desperate energy of hope, fighting against knowledge, calling out as she went, "Mama! Mama, I brought help! I found a nice man like you said I should." The front door stood slightly ajar, hanging crooked on leather hinges that had seen better days. Jed followed Amelia's voice through the doorway and into a single room that served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom for what had apparently been a family of 5. The smell hit him first, the sweet, cloying odor of death in a closed space. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light and he saw her. The woman lay on a straw mattress in the corner, covered by a faded quilt that might once have been beautiful. She was painfully thin, her dark hair spread across a pillow that had been carefully arranged by small, loving hands. Her face was peaceful, as if she had simply chosen to sleep and never wake up. Amelia knelt beside the bed, shaking her mother's shoulder with gentle persistence. "Mama, I brought help. The nice man came just like you said he would. Mama, please wake up." Jed's throat closed around words he couldn't speak. He'd seen death before, too many times. But this was different. This was a woman who had died slowly, probably from starvation or illness or both, while trying to care for children she couldn't protect. The careful arrangement of her body, the way her hands were folded across her chest, told him that Amelia had been here for days, perhaps weeks, trying to wake someone who would never wake again. "Amelia," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Honey, your mama has gone to be with the angels." She looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "I know," she whispered. "I think I've known for a while, but I didn't want to be alone." The simple honesty of it broke something inside Jed's chest. Here was a child who had been caring for a dead mother and searching for missing siblings, while somehow maintaining the faith that help would come. The strength it must have taken, the courage and hope in the face of impossible circumstances, reminded him of qualities he'd once believed in. "Where are your brothers, Amelia? Tommy and Samuel?" Her face clouded with confusion and worry. "Papa came back one night, but he was different, angry and scary. He took Tommy and Samuel away in the wagon. Mama cried and cried, but she was too sick to stop him. He said they had to come with him to work, that they'd come back when they'd earned their keep." Blackjack Morrison. The name settled in Jed's mind like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of memory and recognition through everything he thought he knew about this situation. Morrison wasn't just an outlaw. He was a man who would use his own children as bargaining chips, who would abandon a sick wife and take 2 young boys to God knew what kind of life. Standing in that small, death-scented room, with a brave little girl clinging to a broken doll and looking at him with trust he didn't deserve, Jed felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. This wasn't just about helping a child in need. This was about confronting the kind of evil that had taken his own family, the kind of random cruelty that had taught him that good intentions weren't always enough. But sometimes he was beginning to understand they were all you had. The desert held its breath while Jed dug. The ground was hard as stone, baked by years of sun and drought, and each shovelful felt like chipping away at his own resistance to the responsibility settling on his shoulders. Amelia sat in the shade of the cottonwood, talking quietly to her broken doll, and occasionally offering directions about how deep the hole should be. "Mama always said she wanted to be buried facing the sunrise," Amelia said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children used when dealing with concepts too large for their understanding. She said that way she could see the new day coming. Jed adjusted the angle of the grave accordingly, though his hands shook slightly as he worked. He'd buried his share of people over the years, victims of violence, accidents, the simple cruelties of frontier life, but this felt different, personal. This was a woman who had died protecting her children, who had sent her youngest daughter into the desert with nothing but hope and a prayer that someone decent would answer. When the grave was finished, Jed carried the woman's body outside wrapped in her own quilt. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that spoke to the slow starvation that had claimed her life. As he lowered her into the earth, he noticed that her hands had been soft once, that she'd worn a simple gold wedding ring that caught the afternoon light. Amelia stood beside the grave, with a solemnity that belonged on someone decades older. She clutched her doll with one hand and held a small bouquet of desert wildflowers with the other, scraggly things that had somehow found enough moisture to bloom in this harsh place. "Should we say some words?" Jed asked. She nodded gravely. "Mama taught me a prayer." Her voice was clear and sweet as she recited words about green pastures and still waters, about walking through valleys of shadow without fear. Jed found himself remembering Catherine's funeral, the way Sarah had stood beside the grave, asking questions he couldn't answer about where people went when they died and why God let bad things happen to good people. After the prayer, they filled. In the grave, in silence, Jed fashioned a crude cross from pieces of wood salvaged from the broken chicken coop and carved "beloved wife and mother" into the crossbeam with his knife. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and sometimes honest was the best you could manage. With the burial complete, Jed turned his attention to searching the homestead for clues about the missing boys. The house yielded little. A few items of clothing, some basic cooking implements, and a small stash of coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard. But in a wooden crate beside the bed, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a leather journal, its pages filled with entries in a rough, angular handwriting. The first few pages detailed mundane ranch business, cattle counts, weather observations, plans for spring planting. But as Jed read further, the tone grew darker, more erratic. "The boys are getting too soft," read one entry. "Tommy cries when I have to discipline him. Samuel asks too many questions about right and wrong. They need to learn that survival matters more than conscience." Another entry, dated just 2 months ago. "Maria is getting worse. Keeps talking about taking the children to her sister in Santa Fe. Doesn't understand that the boys belong with me now. They're old enough to be useful, old enough to learn the family business." The final entry was the most chilling. "Time to collect what's owed. The children will come with me. Insurance against anyone trying to be a hero. 3 children can open doors that stay closed to a lone gunman." Jed's hands tightened on the journal as the implications became clear. Morrison wasn't just using his children as labor. He was planning to use them as human shields, as leverage in whatever criminal enterprise he was planning. The thought of 2 young boys being dragged into that kind of life, being forced to watch their father commit acts of violence, made Jed's stomach turn. "What did you find?" Amelia asked, appearing at his elbow with the quiet way children had of materializing when adults were trying to have serious thoughts. "Your papa left some notes," Jed said carefully. "Do you remember anything about where he might have taken Tommy and Samuel?" Her face scrunched up in concentration. "He talked about meeting some men in Las Cruces, and he had a map with marks on it, places where he said there was work to be done. He showed it to the boys and told them they'd learn to be men on the trail. Las Cruces was 3 days' hard ride south, a growing town where a man with flexible morals could find plenty of opportunities for mischief. It was also big enough that 2 children could disappear into the crowd of laborers, drifters, and opportunists who gathered around any settlement with money-changing hands." As the afternoon wore on, Jed found himself studying Amelia with growing concern. She was handling her mother's death and her brother's absence with a composure that spoke to either remarkable resilience or deep shock. She helped him search the homestead with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had learned early that survival depended on paying attention to details. "Are you taking me back to town now?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "Mama always said that if something happened to her, I should find good people who could take care of me." The question hit Jed like a physical blow. Of course, she would expect to be handed off to someone else. That was what responsible adults did with orphaned children. They found proper families, people with experience raising children, women who knew about things like hair ribbons and bedtime stories. But looking at Amelia's upturned face, seeing the trust there, despite everything she'd endured, Jed felt something shift inside his chest. This child had chosen him, had walked miles across dangerous territory to find him specifically. She'd looked at his weathered face and seen something worthy of that trust, some quality he'd forgotten he possessed. "For tonight, you'll stay with me," he said finally. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." The ride back to Socorro was different from their morning journey. Amelia was quieter now, the weight of saying goodbye to her mother settling over her like a blanket. But she sat straighter in the saddle, and when she spoke to her doll, her words carried a new kind of determination. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered to the toy. "We're going to find Tommy and Samuel. The nice man is going to help us bring them home." Jed didn't correct her assumption, though he knew that bringing her brothers home would mean confronting Black Jack Morrison directly. It would mean abandoning the safe, quiet life he'd built and stepping back into a world of violence and moral complexity he'd sworn to leave behind. But as they rode through the gathering dusk toward Socorro, with a brave little girl trusting him to make everything right, Jed began to understand that some choices weren't really choices at all. Some responsibilities found you whether you wanted them or not, and the only real decision was whether you'd meet them with courage or run away. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, tiny points of light in the vast darkness of the desert sky. Tomorrow, he would have to start making decisions about Amelia's future, about the missing boys, about how much of his own safety he was willing to sacrifice for people who weren't his blood but might become his responsibility. Tonight, though, it was enough to ride toward home with a child who trusted him and a purpose that felt, for the first time in years, like something worth pursuing. Jed's ranch had never felt smaller than it did with a 6-year-old girl exploring every corner with the intense curiosity of someone discovering a new world. Amelia moved through the modest adobe house like a cautious cat, touching surfaces gently and asking permission before sitting on furniture or opening doors. "This is where you sleep?" she asked, peering into his bedroom with its simple wooden bed and single dresser. "It is. You can take the bed tonight. I'll make a bedroll by the fire." She shook her head firmly. "Mama taught me not to take things that belong to other people. I can sleep on the floor. I'm used to it." The casual way she said it, without self-pity or complaint, told Jed more about her recent life than any detailed explanation could have. He found himself wondering how long the family had been struggling, how many nights this little girl had gone to sleep hungry or cold, while her father pursued whatever dark business had eventually claimed her brothers. He made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, watching as Amelia ate with the careful manners of someone who had been taught proper behavior, but also the quick efficiency of someone who understood that food might not always be available. She saved the last piece of cornbread, wrapping it carefully in a scrap of cloth. "For tomorrow," she explained when she noticed his questioning look. "Mama always said to save something for tomorrow, just in case." After supper, she pulled a small object from her dress pocket and held it out to him with both hands. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, hanging from a delicate chain that had been carefully mended in several places. "Mama gave me this before she got too sick to talk much," Amelia said. "She said it had pictures of all of us together, from when we were happy." She showed him how to open the tiny clasp, revealing a photograph that had been carefully cut to fit the locket's dimensions. The image was faded but clear enough to make out the faces, a younger woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, 2 boys who shared Amelia's wheat-colored hair, and Amelia herself, probably taken a year or 2 earlier, when she still carried the soft roundness of early childhood. "That's Tommy," she said, pointing to the taller of the boys. "He's 10 now, and he's really good at fixing things that are broken. And that's Samuel. He's 8, and he knows more stories than anyone. He makes them up in his head and tells them when we're scared or sad. Jed studied the faces in the photograph, memorizing them. These boys were real now, not just abstract concepts of missing children. They had names and personalities and talents, and somewhere out there they were probably scared and confused and hoping someone would come for them. "We're going to find them," he said, the words coming out before he'd consciously decided to speak. "Them." Amelia's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I knew you would help. When I saw you in town, I knew you were the kind of man who keeps his promises." Her faith in him was both humbling and terrifying. Jed hadn't made a promise to anyone in 7 years, had carefully avoided any commitment that might require him to risk his heart or his life for someone else's welfare. But looking at this brave little girl, clutching her locket and trusting him with her family's future, he found himself willing to make an exception. That night, after Amelia had finally agreed to sleep in his bed while he took the floor, Jed sat by the dying fire and planned. Las Cruces was the obvious starting point, but Morrison would have associates, safe houses, contacts who could help him disappear if he felt threatened. A frontal approach would likely result in the children being moved again, possibly to somewhere much harder to find. He would need information, the kind that came from careful questioning and patient investigation. He would need to think like a lawman again, to remember the skills that had once made him good at his job. The thought both excited and frightened him. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to care about the outcome of anything that the intensity of his concern for these children felt overwhelming. Around midnight, he was startled by a small sound from the bedroom. Amelia was crying. Not the dramatic sobs of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, hopeless weeping of someone who had learned that loud grief brought unwanted attention. He found her curled up in the center of his bed, clutching both her, a broken doll and the silver locket, her small body shaking with the effort of trying to cry silently. "Hey now," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's all right to be sad. You've had about the worst day a person can have." "I keep thinking about Tommy and Samuel," she whispered. "What if they're scared? What if they think I didn't try to find them? What if Papa is being mean to them?" Jed felt his own throat tighten. "Your brothers know you love them, and they know you're brave enough to get help. That's something they can hold on to no matter what else is happening. Will you tell me about your little girl?" Amelia asked suddenly. "You have that look that grown-ups get when they're remembering someone who's gone away." The question caught him off guard. He'd become so practiced at avoiding conversations about Sarah and Catherine that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone ask directly. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally. "She was about your age when she died. She had dark hair like her mama, and she could whistle louder than any boy in the territory. She used to help me with the horses, said she was going to be a rancher when she grew up. What happened to her? Bad men hurt her and her mama. I was away, and I couldn't protect them." Amelia was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious consideration children gave to important truths. "Is that why you live by yourself? Because you're afraid of caring about people who might get hurt?" The simple directness of the question took his breath away. Here was a child who had just lost her mother and was facing an uncertain future, and she was worried about his emotional well-being. "Maybe," he admitted. "But I'm learning that being afraid doesn't always mean you shouldn't do something. Sometimes it just means the something is important enough to be worth the fear." She nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mama used to say that brave people aren't the ones who don't get scared. They're the ones who do what's right, even when they are scared." Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. But Jed lay awake until dawn, listening to the sound of another person in his house and trying to remember what it felt like to have someone depending on him for more than just their daily bread. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of tracking down Morrison and the missing boys. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts. Doc Henderson's fingers traced the edges of the bloodied map with the careful precision of a surgeon examining a wound. The paper was stained with what looked like dried blood and coffee, its corners torn from rough handling. Red X marks dotted various locations throughout the territory, connected by thin pencil lines that formed a pattern of movement and purpose. "This came from Morrison's saddlebags?" Henderson asked, adjusting his spectacles to better examine the cramped notations. "Written in the margins. Found it wedged behind a loose board in the homestead wall," Jed replied. "Amelia didn't know it was there, but it explains a lot about where he's been and where he might be headed." They sat in Henderson's office, the morning light streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Amelia was outside, feeding carrots to Constance and chattering to the horse about her brothers, with the easy confidence of a child who believed adults could fix any problem if they just tried hard enough. The map told a story of systematic criminal activity stretching back at least 6 months. Banks, mining offices, cattle stations, all marked with dates and notations about guard schedules, money shipments, and security weaknesses. But it was the newest marks that caught Jed's attention. A cluster of X's around Las Cruces, with notes about labor opportunities and boys old enough to work. "He's been planning this for a while," Henderson observed. "Using the children as cover for reconnaissance, maybe even as pickpockets or distractions. Boys that age can get into places adults can't, ask questions without raising suspicion." Jed's jaw tightened. The thought of Tommy and Samuel being forced to participate in their father's crimes, to become accomplices whether they wanted to or not, filled him with a cold rage that reminded him why he'd been good at his job as sheriff. Some kinds of evil deserved to be stopped, regardless of the personal cost. "There's something else," Henderson said, pointing to a series of numbers written along the border of the map. "These look like dates and times, coordination points with other gang members maybe. If Morrison is working with a larger group, finding the boys becomes a lot more complicated." As if summoned by their conversation, Vicente appeared in the doorway of the medical office, his usually jovial expression replaced by one of concern. "Jed, we need to talk," he said. "There are strangers in town asking questions about a little girl. Rough-looking men who don't seem interested in conducting legitimate business." The 3 men exchanged glances. They'd all lived in the territory long enough to recognize the signs of trouble brewing, and strangers asking about children rarely meant anything good. "How many?" Jed asked. 3, maybe 4. They're being careful not to travel together, but they have that look, you know, the professional troublemakers. One of them was asking Maria Santos if she'd seen a little blonde girl, claiming to be a relative concerned about his lost niece. Through the window, they could see Amelia still talking to Constance, completely unaware that her brief moment of safety might be coming to an end. She had braided the horse's mane with pieces of grass and was now attempting to teach the patient animal to shake hands, a sight that would have been charming under different circumstances. "Morrison must have sent them," Henderson said. "Maybe he realized the girl could identify him, or maybe he wants to use her as leverage to keep the boys in line." Jed felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, heavier. Now, because it included not just his own safety, but that of a child who trusted him completely. The smart thing would be to take Amelia to the sheriff in Las Cruces, to hand over the map and the information about Morrison's activities to people who were still officially charged with enforcing the law. But the smart thing wasn't always the right thing. And Jed had learned the hard way that sometimes the law moved too slowly to protect the people who needed protecting most. By the time official channels processed the information and organized a response, Tommy and Samuel could be moved again, or worse. "I need to get her out of town," he said. "Tonight, before these men figure out where she is." "And go where?" Vicente asked. "If Morrison has men looking for her here, he probably has men watching other places too. A man traveling alone with a little girl is going to attract attention anywhere he goes." It was Henderson who provided the answer. though his suggestion carried risks of its own. "My sister runs a boarding house in Massilia," he said. "It's off the main roads, the kind of place where people mind their own business. You could leave the girl there while you track down the boys." Jed shook his head immediately. "I'm not leaving her with strangers. She's been through enough abandonment for one lifetime." "Then you take her with you," Vicente said. "But understand what that means. You'll be putting a child in danger, traveling into territory controlled by armed men who won't hesitate to hurt her if it serves their purposes." The choice felt impossible. Leave Amelia somewhere safe, but among strangers who might not understand her needs, or take her into danger, but keep her close enough to protect. Both options carried the potential for disaster, the kind of consequences that would haunt him regardless of which path he chose. "What does your gut tell you?" Henderson asked, recognizing the internal struggle playing out on Jed's face. Before Jed could answer, Amelia appeared in the doorway, her small face bright with excitement. "Constance learned to shake hands," she announced. "Well, sort of. She lifts her foot when I ask her to anyway. Are we going somewhere today? You all look like you're planning something important." The three men looked at each other, each recognizing that this decision couldn't be made without input from the person most affected by it. Amelia might be only 6 years old, but she'd proven herself capable of remarkable courage and insight. Maybe she deserved to have a voice in her own future. "We might need to take a trip," Jed said carefully. "Some men are looking for you, and it might not be safe to stay here much longer." Her expression grew serious, the playful child replaced by someone who understood the realities of a dangerous world. "Are they Papa's men?" she asked. "We think so." She was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently stroking the silver locket at her throat. When she spoke again, her voice carried a determination that belonged on someone much older. "If we're going to find Tommy and Samuel, then we should go. I can help. I know things about Papa and his friends that might be important. And besides," she added with a small smile, "I'm not afraid as long as you're with me." Standing in that cluttered medical office, surrounded by the evidence of Morrison's criminal network and the growing threat to their safety, Jed made his choice. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to Las Cruces, following a trail that might lead to the boys or might lead to disaster. But tonight, he would hold on to the trust of a brave little girl who believed he could make everything right, even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The broken pocket watch lay open in Jed's palm, its hands frozen at 11:47, the exact time Catherine had drawn her last breath 20 years ago. He'd carried it every day since then, a talisman of guilt and memory that he'd never been able to put away. The crystal face was cracked in a spider-web pattern from the day he'd thrown it against the wall in rage, and the delicate gold chain had been repaired so many times it was more solder than original metal. "That's pretty," Amelia said, peering at the watch from her perch on the wagon seat beside him. "Does it still work?" "No," Jed replied, closing the watch with a soft click. "It stopped working a long time ago." They'd been traveling for 2 days, following back roads and deer trails to avoid the main routes where Morrison's men might be watching. The journey to Las Cruces normally took 3 days of hard riding, but with a child and the need for stealth, Jed estimated it would take them at least 5. The wagon was loaded with supplies and camping gear, but more importantly, it provided cover for their true purpose. Anyone who saw them would assume they were just another family heading to market. The landscape around them told the story of a land caught between seasons. The winter rains had been sparse, leaving the desert vegetation brittle and brown, but here and there new growth pushed through the hard-packed earth with the stubborn persistence of life refusing to surrender. It reminded Jed of his own situation, dormant for years, now unexpectedly sprouting new purpose. Amelia had proven to be an ideal traveling companion. She asked thoughtful questions, helped with camp chores without being asked, and entertained herself for hours by making up stories about the rock formations and wildlife they encountered. But it was her insights about her father and brothers that proved most valuable. "Papa always said Tommy was too soft," she explained. as they made camp on their second night. He cried when Papa made him help skin rabbits, and he wouldn't fight back when the older boys in town picked on him. But Papa was wrong about that. Tommy isn't soft. He's just kind. There's a difference. She poked at the campfire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. Samuel is different. He's quiet, but he notices everything. He can tell you exactly what someone was wearing 3 days ago, or remember every word of a conversation he overheard. Papa said that made him useful, but it also made him dangerous because he remembered things Papa wanted forgotten. Each detail she shared helped Jed build a clearer picture of the boys they were trying to find. Tommy, the sensitive 10-year-old who would be struggling with whatever his father was forcing him to do. Samuel, the observant 8-year-old who might have information that could help them, but who would also be deeply traumatized by what he'd witnessed. On the morning of their third day, they encountered their first real sign that they were getting close to Morrison's territory. Amelia spotted it first, a crude wooden cross marking a grave beside the trail, with a name carved in shaky letters. Deputy Martin Reeves, died in service. That's new, she said quietly. That wasn't there when we came this way before. Jed examined the grave more closely. The wood was weathered but not old, and the disturbed earth suggested the burial had taken place within the last few months. A lawman's grave in the middle of nowhere usually meant one thing. He'd been killed while pursuing criminals who didn't want to be caught. Was Deputy Reeves a good man? Amelia asked. I knew him, Jed replied. He was young, maybe 25. Eager to prove himself, maybe too eager. He had a new wife and a baby on the way. The grave served as a sobering reminder of what they were walking into. Morrison wasn't just a father who'd made bad choices. He was a killer who would eliminate anyone who threatened his operation. And now Jed was deliberately putting himself and Amelia in the path of that violence. That afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Las Cruces. The town had grown since Jed's last visit, spreading out from the original plaza in a sprawling collection of adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and tent structures that housed the overflow of people drawn by rumors of silver strikes and business opportunities. It was the kind of place where strangers were common and questions were discouraged, perfect for someone like Morrison who needed to operate without attracting official attention. Jed found a boarding house on the edge of town run by a weathered woman named Mrs. Garcia, who asked no questions about a man traveling with his niece and accepted his money without requiring names in her guest register. Their room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out onto the dusty street. Tomorrow we start looking for your brothers, Jed told Amelia as they settled in for the night. But I need you to promise me something. You'll stay close and do exactly what I tell you, even if you don't understand why. She nodded solemnly. I promise. But Jed, what if we're too late? What if Papa has already moved them again? It was the question that had been haunting him since they'd left Socorro. Morrison was smart and paranoid, and he would know that taking the children made him vulnerable. If he suspected pursuit, he might decide that the boys were more liability than asset. We'll find them, Jed said with more confidence than he felt. Your brothers are counting on us, and we're not going to let them down. As Amelia drifted off to sleep, Jed sat by the window watching the street outside. Las Cruces after dark was a different place than during the day. Rougher, more dangerous, full of the kind of people who conducted their business away from prying eyes. Somewhere in this maze of streets and buildings, 2 frightened boys were probably wondering if anyone was looking for them. He pulled out the broken pocket watch again, studying the frozen hands in the dim light. For 20 years, this watch had been a reminder of his failures, of the family he'd been unable to protect. But tonight, holding it while a brave little girl slept nearby and her missing brothers waited somewhere in the darkness, it felt different. Maybe. It was time to stop measuring himself by the moments when time had stopped and start focusing on the time that remained. Maybe healing wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about learning to carry the pieces with grace while building something new. Tomorrow, he would begin the most dangerous part of their journey. But tonight, for the first time in decades, the weight of the broken watch in his pocket felt more like a promise than a burden. The letter was wedged behind a loose brick in the wall of the abandoned warehouse, written in Morrison's distinctive scrawl and sealed with wax that still bore the impression of his ring. Jed's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper, aware that whatever it contained would change everything about their mission. "My dear Sheriff Thornton," the letter began, and Jed's blood turned to ice. "Yes, I know exactly who you are, though you've done an admirable job of pretending to be just another broken-down rancher these past 7 years. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the man who killed my brother?" The words hit Jed like physical blows. He forced himself to keep reading, though each line revealed another layer of the trap he'd unknowingly walked into. "You see, Jeremiah, this was never about my children running away or some chance encounter with my sweet little Amelia in Socorro. This has been 20 years in the planning, ever since you put 3 bullets in Billy Morrison during that cattle rustling business up near Silver City. Oh, you were just doing your job, I'm sure, enforcing the law, protecting property, being the kind of righteous man who sleeps well at night, knowing he's made the world a little safer for decent folks." The memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. Billy Morrison, barely 19 years old, caught red-handed with a herd of stolen cattle. The boy had gone for his gun when Jed tried to arrest him, and Jed had reacted with the split second, timing that had kept him alive through 2 decades of law enforcement. It had been a clean shooting, justified and legal, but that didn't change the fact that a young man had died. Billy was the only family I had left after the Apaches killed our parents. He was wild, I'll grant you, but he was just a boy trying to make his way in a hard world. You took that away from him, and you took away the only person who mattered to me. So I decided to return the favor. Jed's vision blurred as the full scope of Morrison's revenge became clear. The attack on his ranch, the murder of Catherine and Sarah, it hadn't been random Apache violence. It had been carefully orchestrated retribution, planned and executed by a man who understood that the worst way to hurt someone wasn't to kill them, but to take away everything they loved and leave them alive to suffer. I hired those Apache raiders. Sheriff paid them well to hit your ranch while you were away chasing shadows in the mountains, told them to make it look random, just another tragic incident in a dangerous territory, and it worked beautifully, didn't it? You spent 20 years blaming yourself for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, never suspecting that it was all carefully arranged. The paper crackled in Jed's hands as his grip tightened. Around him, the abandoned mining camp, where they'd tracked the boys, felt like a tomb, silent except for the whisper of wind through broken timbers. Amelia sat nearby, carefully arranging stones in patterns, while Tommy and Samuel, miraculously wonderfully alive, slept in the meager shade of a collapsed wall. Finding the boys had been almost anticlimactic. They'd been exactly where Morrison's map indicated they would be, working as unpaid laborers in the illegal mining operation run by one of Morrison's associates. The mine supervisor had been easy to deal with. One look at Jed's gun and his reputation as a former lawman had been enough to secure the children's release without bloodshed. But now, reading Morrison's confession, Jed understood that the rescue had been too easy. Morrison had wanted them to find the boys, had orchestrated the entire situation to bring Jed to this place at this time. By the time you read this, you'll be wondering why I made it so simple for you to find Tommy and Samuel. The answer is that they were never the real prize. They were bait. You are the prize, Jeremiah. You and my dear daughter, who has proven quite useful in drawing you out of whatever hole you've been hiding in all these years. The letter continued with chilling detail about Morrison's knowledge of their movements, his network of informants, his careful manipulation of events to ensure that Jed would feel compelled to rescue the children. Every choice Jed had made, every decision that had felt like an expression of free will, had actually been the result of psychological strings being pulled by a master manipulator. You're probably wondering about the children's safety. Let me be clear, I have no intention of harming Tommy, Samuel, or Amelia. They are my flesh and blood, after all, and despite what you might think, I'm not a monster. But they serve a very important purpose in what's about to happen. Movement in the rocks above caught Jed's attention. Men with rifles positioned to cover all the escape routes from the canyon. Professional killers, judging by the way they moved and the discipline of their positioning. Morrison had indeed been planning this for a long time. The children will. Watch while I kill you, Sheriff. They'll see what happens to men who interfere with family business. And then they'll come with me, and I'll teach them the lessons their soft-hearted mother never could, that the world is cruel, that strength is the only virtue that matters, and that family loyalty comes before everything else, including law and morality. Amelia looked up from her stone arrangements, sensing the change in Jed's demeanor. What does the letter say? She asked. Tommy and Samuel stirred at the sound of her voice. The boys were thin and sunburned from their weeks of forced labor, but alive and relatively unharmed. Tommy, the sensitive 10-year-old Amelia had described, had immediately attached himself to Jed with the desperate gratitude of someone who had given up hope of rescue. Samuel, quiet and observant, had said little, but watched everything with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a complex and dangerous situation. It says your father has been watching us, Jed replied, trying to keep his voice calm, despite the storm of rage and grief tearing through his chest. It says this was all planned. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, and Blackjack Morrison rode into view with the casual confidence of a man who held all the advantages. He was older than Jed had expected, probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor living. But his eyes were young and bright with malicious intelligence, and when he smiled at the sight of his children clustered around Jed, it was the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Hello, Sheriff," Morrison called out, dismounting with fluid grace. "I was wondering when you'd get around to reading my letter. I hope you appreciate the effort I put into arranging this reunion." More riders appeared from concealment. 6 men, all armed, all with the hard look of professional gunfighters. They spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape while maintaining clear lines of fire. "Papa," Amelia said, quietly, but she didn't move toward him. Instead, she stepped closer to Jed, her small hand finding his arm. "Hello, darling," Morrison replied, though his attention remained fixed on Jed. "I hope you've been well cared for. I know this gentleman has a soft spot for children. It's what makes him so predictable." Tommy and Samuel said nothing, but Jed could feel their fear like a physical presence. These boys had spent weeks in their father's custody, and whatever they'd experienced had taught them that silence was safer than speaking. "Let the children go," Jed said. "This is between you and me." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Sheriff. This is very much about the children. They're going to learn some important lessons today about what happens when family loyalty conflicts with outside interference." He gestured to his men, who began moving closer with the practiced coordination of soldiers following a familiar plan. "You killed my brother 20 years ago, and I returned the favor by killing your family. Now we're going to finish what we started, and my children are going to understand exactly what their father is capable of when someone threatens what's his." Standing in that sun-baked canyon, surrounded by armed men and holding a letter that revealed the depth of his enemies. Planning and hatred, Jed finally understood the true scope of the trap he'd walked into. This wasn't just about rescuing 3 children. It was about confronting the architect of his deepest grief and darkest memories. But looking at Amelia's trusting face and the frightened eyes of her brothers, Jed also understood something else. Sometimes The most important battles were the ones you were destined to lose, fought not for victory, but for the chance to protect something more valuable than your own life. The cavalry saber felt alien in Jed's hands after so many years. His father had carried it through the war between the states, had passed it down to his son with stories of honor and duty that seemed like fairy tales in the harsh light of the New Mexico desert. The blade was tarnished with age and neglect, but when Jed drew it from its leather scabbard, the steel still held an edge sharp enough to split the desert wind. Morrison's men had withdrawn to positions on the canyon rim, creating a natural amphitheater for what their leader clearly intended to be both execution and education. The children sat huddled together near the abandoned mine entrance, close enough to hear every word, but far enough away to be clear of the immediate violence. Morrison had calculated even this detail. They would witness everything, but survive to carry the memory forward. "That's an interesting choice of weapon," Morrison observed, watching Jed test the balance of the saber. "Most men would reach for a gun in a situation like this. Most men haven't spent the last hour realizing that their entire adult life has been shaped by another man's revenge," Jed replied. "A gun seems too quick, too clean for what we have to settle." The truth was more practical than philosophical. Morrison's men controlled the high ground with rifles, and any attempt to fight with firearms would end quickly and badly. But the saber represented something deeper, a connection to his father's belief that some fights were worth having regardless of the outcome, that a man's character was defined not by his victories, but by what he was willing to die for. Morrison drew his own blade, a newer weapon with a polished steel guard and wrapped leather grip. "You know, Sheriff, I've spent 20 years imagining this moment. In my dreams, you always begged. You pleaded for mercy, for a chance to explain, for one more day of the pathetic life you've been living since I took away everything that mattered to you." "Sorry to disappoint you," Jed said, settling into the fighting stance his father had taught him 40 years ago. "But I stopped begging for things a long time ago." The canyon filled with the sound of steel meeting steel as their blades crossed for the first time. Morrison was skilled, better than Jed had expected from a man who usually relied on guns and intimidation. His technique was fluid and aggressive, the product of years spent in saloons and back alleys where sword work was as practical as marksmanship. But Jed had advantages Morrison couldn't see. The years of isolation hadn't been wasted. He'd spent countless evenings practicing with the saber, working through forms and exercises that kept his father's memory alive while serving as meditation on violence and its consequences. More importantly, he was fighting for something Morrison couldn't understand, not for revenge or pride, but for the chance to give 3 children a future free from their father's poison. "Tell me about my wife," Jed said between attacks, using words as weapons to disrupt Morrison's rhythm. "Did you watch when they killed her? Did you enjoy it?" Morrison's blade wavered slightly. "She fought like a wildcat. Even with 3 arrows in her, she kept trying to reach your daughter. Admirable, really, if ultimately pointless." The description hit Jed like a physical blow, but he transformed the pain into fury, driving forward with a combination that forced Morrison back toward the canyon wall. For a moment, the outlaw's confident expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "The Apache who killed them," Jed continued, pressing his attack. "Are they still alive?" "Dead 10 years now," Morrison panted. "Killed by Mexican soldiers near Hermosillo. But I made sure they understood why they were dying, that they'd been tools in a white man's revenge, that their lives meant nothing to me beyond their usefulness." Behind them, Amelia's voice rose in a sound that was part sob, part prayer. "Stop talking about Mama Catherine like that. She was good and kind, and she didn't deserve to die." Both men paused, turning toward the children who had become unwilling witnesses to this settling of old accounts. Tommy had his arms around his sister, while Samuel watched the fight with the analytical attention that Amelia had described, memorizing details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You're right, darling," Morrison called to his daughter. Catherine Thornton didn't deserve to die, but neither did my brother Billy, and the world rarely arranges itself according to what people deserve. That's why strength matters more than justice, why family loyalty trumps moral principle. That's where you're wrong, Jed said, raising his saber again. Justice isn't about what people deserve, it's about what we choose to fight for when everything else has been taken away. The second phase of their duel was more brutal than the first. Both men had taken the measure of the other's skill, and now they fought with the grim efficiency of soldiers who understood that only one of them would walk away from this canyon. Blood began to flow, first from a cut on Morrison's cheek, then from a slice across Jed's shoulder that soaked his shirt with spreading crimson. But it was the psychological warfare that proved most damaging. Morrison spoke constantly as they fought, painting detailed pictures of Catherine's final moments, describing Sarah's tears, recounting the satisfaction he'd felt in orchestrating their deaths. Each word was chosen to wound, to break Jed's concentration and leave him vulnerable to a killing stroke. "She called your name," Morrison taunted during a brief separation. "Catherine did, I mean. The Apaches told me she kept saying Jeremiah over and over, like she expected you to appear and save them. Right up until the end, she believed you would come." The words accomplished their purpose. Jed's guard dropped for just an instant, and Morrison's blade slipped through, carving a deep gash across his ribs. The pain was immediate and intense, but it also brought clarity, the kind of sharp-edged focus that came when everything unnecessary burned away. "You want to know the truth about that day," Jed said, his voice steady despite the blood running down his side. "I did hear them calling. I was 3 miles away when the attack started, and I heard the gunshots echoing off the mountains. But I was tracking those cattle thieves you mentioned, and I thought the shots were hunters or ranchers dealing with predators." Morrison's attacks became more vicious, but also less controlled. "If you'd gone home instead of chasing my brother, Billy was stealing cattle from families who could barely feed their children," Jed interrupted, his blade work becoming more aggressive to match his words. "He was taking the food from babies' mouths to line his own pockets, and when I caught him, he went for his gun instead of surrendering. I gave him every chance to walk away alive. He was 19 years old. So was I when I first pinned on a badge. Age doesn't excuse choices, Morrison. Your brother chose to be a thief, and you chose to make innocent people pay for his mistakes." The fight had drawn closer to the children, and Jed could see the terror in their faces as they watched their father and their protector try to kill each other with medieval weapons in a setting that seemed torn from a fever dream. But he could also see something else. A growing understanding in Amelia's eyes that this wasn't just about adult anger and revenge, but about the kind of man her father really was. Morrison must have seen it too, because his next attack carried the desperate fury of someone who realized he was losing more than just a sword fight. His blade work became wild, sacrificing technique for power as he tried to end the contest quickly, but desperation made him careless. And Jed found the opening he'd been waiting for. His father's saber slipped past Morrison's guard and opened. A long cut across the outlaw's sword arm, deep enough to weaken his grip and slow his reactions. "It's over," Jed said, his blade at Morrison's throat. "Tell your men to stand down." Morrison looked up at the canyon rim, where his hired guns waited for orders. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through stone and the labored breathing of 2 middle-aged men who had fought themselves to exhaustion. "You think killing me solves anything?" Morrison asked. "You think it brings back your wife and daughter, or makes you the hero in some story these children will tell their grandchildren?" "No," Jed replied. "But it stops you from poisoning any more lives with your version of justice." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, balanced on the edge of violence and mercy. In the end, it was Amelia who broke the silence, her small voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. "Don't kill Papa," she said. "Please don't kill him. I don't want to remember you that way. looking into her eyes, so much like Sarah's had been, so full of hope and faith in the possibility of goodness. Jed felt the weight of choice settle on his shoulders one more time. Some victories, he was beginning to understand, were too expensive to be worth winning. Amelia's makeshift cross lay in the dust, where it had fallen from her pocket during the chaos. 2 small sticks bound together with thread from her torn dress. A symbol of faith that seemed impossibly fragile in the face of so much violence. Jed could see it from the corner of his eye as he held his saber at Morrison's throat. A reminder of innocence in a world that had forgotten what innocence looked like. The standoff stretched like a held breath. Morrison's men on the canyon rim waited for orders that weren't coming, their rifles trained on a scene that had spiraled beyond anyone's expectations. This was supposed to have been an execution, a simple matter of revenge served cold after 20 years of careful planning. Instead, it had become something more complex, a test of who these men really were when stripped of their carefully constructed identities. "You're not going to kill me," Morrison said, his voice carrying absolute certainty despite the steel at his neck. "You can't. It's not in your nature anymore. 20 years of guilt and self-blame have made you soft, Sheriff. You've forgotten how to do what needs to be done." Jed's grip tightened on the saber's handle. Every instinct honed by decades of law enforcement screamed at him to finish this, to end the threat Morrison represented not just to the children, but to anyone else who might cross his path. But Amelia's words echoed in his mind. "I don't want to remember you that way." And he found himself wrestling with questions that had no clean answers. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, creating an amphitheater where past and present collided with brutal clarity. 20 years of carefully suppressed rage warred with 20 years of hard-won wisdom, and for a moment Jed felt suspended between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. "Maybe you're right," Jed said finally. "Maybe I have gone soft. But there's a difference between being soft and being wise, and I've learned that some victories cost more than defeats." Morrison laughed, a sound like broken glass in the desert air. "Wisdom, is that what you call 20 years of hiding from responsibility? 20 years of letting other people fight the battles you were too broken to face?" The words hit there. Mark, carving into doubts Jed had carried for decades. Had his withdrawal from law enforcement been wisdom or cowardice? Had he chosen peace or simply chosen the easier path of avoiding choices altogether? "You want to know about responsibility?" Jed asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me tell you what I learned in 20 years of wearing a badge. Every man I killed had a story. Every outlaw I brought in had reasons for the choices he made. Some of them were monsters, yes, but others were just broken people, trying to survive in a world that had ground them down." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Spare me the philosophy lesson, Sheriff. You killed my brother because the law told you to, and I killed your family because my heart told me to. The only difference is that I'm honest about what drives me. The difference," Jed replied, "is that I learned from my mistakes." But before Morrison could respond, the crack of a rifle echoed from the canyon rim. Dust exploded near Jed's feet as one of Morrison's men, apparently deciding the standoff had gone on long enough, took matters into his own hands. "Take them alive!" Morrison shouted, but his words were lost in the chaos as more shots rang out. Jed dove toward the children, tackling them behind the meager cover of some fallen mining equipment as bullets sparked off stone and metal around them. Amelia's scream cut through the gunfire, not terror but rage at seeing her small cross trampled in the dust. "Get down!" Jed yelled, pushing the children deeper into cover as Morrison scrambled for his own protection. The canyon erupted into chaos. Morrison's hired guns, disciplined men who had fought in range wars and territorial disputes, began their descent from the rim with professional efficiency. But they hadn't counted on the terrain working against them, or on the fierce determination of their targets to survive. Tommy, the sensitive boy who cried at violence, surprised everyone by grabbing a piece of broken timber and swinging it at one of Morrison's men who had rappelled down from the rim. The blow caught the gunman across the knees, sending him tumbling into the rocks with a cry of pain and a clatter of dropped weapons. "Good boy," Jed called out, firing his pistol at movement on the canyon walls. "Stay low and keep moving." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trying to protect Morrison's children from Morrison's own men, while Morrison himself crouched behind cover, shouting contradictory orders to subordinates who were no longer listening to anything but their own survival instincts. Samuel, the quiet observer, had found a position where he could watch the entire battlefield. "3 men coming down the north wall," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. 2 more moving along the rim to the east. The one with the scar is trying to flank us from the mine entrance. The boy's tactical awareness was remarkable for someone his age, and Jed found himself relying on Samuel's intelligence reports as he tried to keep the children safe while returning fire. But they were vastly outgunned, and the attackers had the advantage of position and numbers. Morrison, meanwhile, had retrieved his rifle and was shouting orders to his men. "Don't kill Thornton. I want him alive. But watch out for the children. They're more dangerous than they look." It was true. The 3 children, instead of cowering in terror, had become active participants in their own defense. Amelia had armed herself with rocks, which she threw with surprising accuracy at anyone who came too close. Her small face was set in lines of grim determination that reminded Jed painfully of Catherine, during the few times he'd seen his wife truly angry. Tommy continued to wield his piece of timber like a club, using his knowledge of the mining equipment to create improvised obstacles and traps. His gentle nature hadn't disappeared, but it had been tempered by necessity into something harder and more practical. Samuel had appointed himself the group's intelligence officer, using his phenomenal memory to track the movement of each attacker and predict their likely routes of advance. "The man in the brown hat is reloading," he called out. "The one by the minecart has a limp on his left side." But courage and determination couldn't overcome superior firepower indefinitely. Jed felt a bullet graze his already wounded shoulder, sending fresh blood streaming down his arm. Another shot shattered the wooden beam, providing their primary cover, and he knew they had perhaps minutes before their position became completely untenable. The attackers were professional enough to coordinate their assault, laying down covering fire while others advanced. But they were also mercenaries, men who fought for money rather than conviction, and Jed could see uncertainty in their movements. Morrison's authority was cracking under the pressure of circumstances no one had anticipated. That's when he made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd ever learned. Instead of trying to escape or find better cover, he stepped out into the open, his saber raised in challenge. "Morrison!" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Face me yourself, or are you content to let hired guns do your fighting?" The shooting stopped as every man in the canyon turned to stare at what appeared to be either an act of supreme courage or complete insanity. Jed stood fully exposed, bleeding from multiple wounds, challenging a man surrounded by armed allies to single combat. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, suspicion, and finally understanding. This wasn't surrender or desperation. This was a man making a conscious choice about how his story would end. "You think you can manipulate me with appeals to honor?" Morrison called back. "You think I care about fair fights and noble gestures?" "I think you care about what your children remember about this day," Jed replied. "I think you want them to see their father as a man, not a coward who hides behind hired guns." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of desert wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Morrison's men waited for orders, their rifles trained on Jed, but their fingers uncertain on the triggers. This had become something bigger than a simple revenge killing. It had become a test of character that would define everyone present. In the sudden quiet, Amelia's voice rose clear and strong. "Papa, please, end this." Morrison looked at his daughter. Really, looked at her, perhaps for the first time since this ordeal began. He saw the fear in her eyes, yes, but also the love, and beneath that, the growing understanding of what kind of man her father really was. It was a look that cut deeper than any blade. The judgment of innocence confronted with evil and finding it wanting. "All right, Sheriff," Morrison said finally, stepping away from his cover. "Let's finish what we started 20 years ago." The final duel between Jed and Morrison lasted less than 5 minutes, but those minutes contained 20 years of accumulated pain, rage, and desperate hope for redemption. They fought with the savage intensity of men who understood that only one of them would walk away from this canyon, but also with the terrible awareness that 3 children were watching every move, memorizing every blow, carrying these images into whatever future awaited them. Morrison was skilled with a blade, better than Jed had expected from a man who usually relied on guns and intimidation. His technique was fluid and aggressive, the product of years spent in saloons and back alleys where sword work was as practical as marksmanship. But skill alone wasn't enough when facing a man who had nothing left to lose, except the trust of 3 children who believed he could protect them. The turning point came when Morrison, pressing what he thought was an advantage, overextended himself in a thrust aimed at Jed's heart. Jed sidestepped with the economy of movement that came from decades of practice, and his father's cavalry saber found its mark just below Morrison's ribs, sliding between bone and muscle to pierce something vital. Morrison stumbled, his own blade clattering to the rocky ground as he pressed both hands to the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark and spreading, and his face went white with the shock of mortal injury. "Well," he said, his voice already growing weak, "I suppose that settles it." Jed caught him as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. Despite everything that lay between them, there was no satisfaction in the moment, no sense of justice served, only the hollow acknowledgement that violence, even necessary violence, always extracted a price from everyone involved. Morrison's men on the canyon rim made no move to intervene. Professional killers they might be, but they were also practical. Men who understood when a contract had been fulfilled. Their employer was dying, and with him died their obligation to continue a fight that had already cost them more than they'd bargained for. Morrison's dying words came out in gasps, each breath. A struggle against the darkness closing in around him. Jed knelt beside his fallen enemy, close enough to hear the whispered confession that tumbled from lips already turning blue. "The Hendricks Bank in Roswell," Morrison wheezed. "Planned for next month. My men don't know. Thought it was just reconnaissance. But there's a family, the Kellys. They have 4 children. I was going to use them like I used my own boys. Stop it, please." Jed pulled paper from his jacket pocket, the same journal where he'd recorded daily observations about weather and cattle for the past 7 years. Now he used it to document something far more important. The paper where he wrote down Morrison's final words was torn and stained, but each location, each name, each detail of planned crimes represented families who would now be spared the kind of devastation that had shaped both men's lives. "The silver mine near Lordsburg," Morrison continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Hidden stronghold. In the old shaft, maps in a tin box behind the false wall, enough evidence to hang half the territory's outlaws. Tell Sheriff Davidson, he's clean, one of the few who can't be bought." Jed wrote it all down, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was recording. 20 years of accumulated crime, carefully planned and meticulously documented by a man who had trusted no one completely. Morrison's dying confession was a roadmap to justice that would echo across the territory for years to come. "There's more," Morrison gasped, his eyes finding Jed's face in the gathering darkness. "The train robbery near Deming, that wasn't my crew, but I know who did it. The cattle rustling operation in the Gila Valley, I can give you names, dates, everything. How many innocent people can you save with what I'm telling you?" It was a question that cut to the heart of what justice really meant. Morrison wasn't confessing out of remorse. He was trading information for some kind of absolution, trying to balance the scales in the final moments of his life. But regardless of his motives, the information he provided would prevent suffering, would protect families, would serve the greater good. But it was the personal revelations that cut deepest. "Your wife," Morrison whispered, his eyes finding Jed's face in the gathering light. "She wasn't supposed to suffer. Told the Apaches, quick, clean kills, but they were drunk on whiskey and bloodlust. By the time I realized what was happening," his voice broke. "I rode after them, tried to stop it, but I was too late. Catherine was already—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Jed had seen the scene, had lived with the images for 20 years, the knowledge that Morrison had tried, however belatedly, to prevent his family's suffering, added another layer of complexity to a situation already weighted with moral ambiguity. "Sarah," Morrison continued, his voice barely audible now, "your little girl, she fought them. Tiny thing, no bigger than Amelia, but she stood over her mother's body and threw rocks at grown men with rifles. That's courage, Sheriff. That's a kind of courage that runs in families." The comparison to Amelia wasn't lost on either man. Here was another small girl showing impossible bravery in the face of overwhelming danger. Another child forced to grow up too fast in a world that had forgotten how to protect innocence. "I'm sorry," Morrison said, and this time the words carried weight beyond mere politeness. "That's not worth much now, but I'm sorry. Your family didn't deserve what happened to them. Neither did mine." The apology hung between them like a bridge. Across 20 years of hatred and grief, Jed wanted to reject it, to let Morrison die without the comfort of forgiveness. But looking at the children, Amelia clutching her rescued cross, Tommy and Samuel watching their father's life ebb away, he understood that mercy wasn't about what Morrison deserved. It was about what kind of man Jed chose to be in front of. 3 children who would carry this memory forever. "I hear you," Jed said simply. "I hear you." Morrison's hand found his daughter's, his fingers barely able to close around her small palm. "Amelia," he breathed, "you're stronger than I ever was. Don't let my mistakes poison your heart. The boys, take care of your brothers. Love them better than I did." "I will, Papa," she whispered, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. "I promise." Tommy knelt on Morrison's other side, his sensitive nature overcome by the sight of his father's pain. Despite everything Morrison had put him through, the boy's compassionate heart couldn't bear to see anyone suffer. "Papa, I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted." "No," Morrison said, his voice gaining momentary strength from the need to correct this misunderstanding. "You were exactly what you should be. Kind, gentle. The world needs more men like you, not fewer. Don't change that. Promise me you won't change that." Tommy nodded through his tears, accepting his father's final blessing on the very qualities that had once seemed like weaknesses. Samuel, ever the observer, had been silent through most of the exchange, but now he leaned forward, his young face serious with understanding beyond his years. "Papa, why did you take us away from Mama?" Morrison's eyes closed, and for a moment Jed thought he might have slipped away without answering. But then he spoke. Again, his words barely audible above the desert wind. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd grow up soft like your mother wanted. Afraid you'd choose her way instead of mine when the world showed you its teeth. But I was wrong. Her way was the harder path, the braver one. Forgiveness takes more courage than revenge." The confession seemed to drain the last of his strength. Morrison's breathing became shallow and labored, each breath a visible effort, but his eyes remained fixed on his children's faces, memorizing them one final time. "The men on the rim," he whispered to Jed. "They'll scatter now that I'm dying. Most are cowards without leadership. But watch for Cutter McKee, scarred face, missing left eye. He won't give up the vendetta. He loved Billy like a brother. Jed nodded, filing away the warning even as he wondered if he'd live long enough for it to matter. His own wounds were serious, and the blood loss was making him lightheaded, but he forced himself to stay alert, to be present for Morrison's final moments and the children who would remember this scene for the rest of their lives. As if summoned by Morrison's words, the sound of horses echoed from the canyon rim. His surviving men were indeed abandoning their positions, unwilling to continue a fight that had lost its meaning with their leader's impending death. The practical criminals were cutting their losses and fleeing, leaving behind only the desert, wind, and the settling dust of their departure. "Jed," Morrison said, his voice now barely a whisper, "take care of them. All three. Don't let what I was define what they become. They deserve better than the life I could give them." "I give you my word," Jed replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Morrison smiled then, an expression that transformed his weathered face into something almost peaceful. "Funny," he murmured. 20 years planning revenge. And in the end, the only thing that matters is whether someone will love your children after you're gone." His breath caught, released, and then stopped altogether. Blackjack Morrison died as the sun touched the western rim of the canyon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to set the entire world on fire. His children gathered around his still form, each processing the loss in their own way. Amelia wept openly, grieving for the father she'd hoped he could become. Tommy mourned silently, his gentle heart breaking for all the pain that could have been avoided. Samuel watched and remembered, his keen mind already working to understand how this ending had grown from all the choices that came before. Jed pulled a blanket from his saddlebags and covered Morrison's body, then gathered the children close. They had survived the immediate danger, but they were still miles from safety, and his own injuries were more serious than he'd let them see. The journey home would test whatever strength they had left, but as he looked at their faces in the dying light, bruised and frightened but unbroken, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Not peace exactly, and certainly not happiness, but purpose, the clear, simple purpose of protecting something precious and helping it grow. The paper containing Morrison's confession lay weighted with stones beside his body, a record of crimes and sorrows that would help other families avoid the kind of pain that had brought them all to this place. It was a small justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. "Come on," he said, lifting Amelia into his arms while the boys gathered their few possessions. "Let's go home." Behind them, Morrison's confession fluttered in the desert wind, its words, a final gift from a dying man to a world he'd spent too many years trying to hurt. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of horses fading into silence marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. And sometimes, Jed was learning, that was how healing began, not with grand gestures or perfect resolutions, but with the simple decision to choose love over vengeance, hope over despair, and tomorrow over yesterday. 3 months later, the family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its pages reflecting the warm light of the oil lamp as Jed carefully entered the children's names in the space reserved for family records. The leather-bound book was new, purchased during their last trip to Socorro, and it smelled of possibility and fresh beginnings. The weight of it in his hands felt significant, not just as a book, but as a symbol of the family they had chosen to become. Amelia Rose Morrison Thornton, he wrote in his careful script, the pen moving slowly across the pristine page. Born June 15, 1881. Adopted November 3, 1887. Thomas James Morrison Thornton. Born March 22, 1877. Adopted November 3, 1887. Samuel William Morrison Thornton. Born September 8, 1879. Adopted November 3, 1887. The legal proceedings had been complicated, but not insurmountable. Judge Martinez in Las Cruces had known Morrison's reputation and was more than willing to grant custody to the man who had ended the outlaw's reign of terror. The judge had read through Morrison's dying confession with growing amazement, recognizing the significance of the information that would help law enforcement across the territory. Doc Henderson had provided testimony about the children's condition. When they'd first arrived in Socorro, describing the malnutrition and signs of neglect that spoke to months of hardship. Father Miguel had vouched for Jed's character despite his long absence from church services, speaking eloquently about redemption and second chances. But it was the children themselves who had made the strongest case for the adoption. When Judge Martinez had asked them individually about their wishes, each had given the same answer. They wanted to stay with the man who had risked everything to bring them home. Amelia had been particularly articulate, telling the judge that Jed was the kind of man who keeps his promises even when it's hard. The ranch had undergone its own transformation. What had once been a place of exile and isolation had become a center of life and activity. The small house had been expanded, with an additional room where the boys slept, built with lumber purchased from the reward money that various banks and territorial authorities had provided for Morrison's capture and the recovery of stolen funds. Amelia had claimed a corner near the kitchen window where morning light fell across her collection of books, a small library that had grown from Father Miguel's donations and purchases made during their monthly trips to town. The wooden doll that had lost its arm during her ordeal now sat proudly on a shelf, fully restored thanks to Tommy's skill with carving tools and Jed's patient instruction in the finer points of woodworking. The sounds of children's voices now filled spaces that had been silent for 7 years. Laughter echoed from the barn during evening chores. Excited conversations about books and horses and plans for the future replaced the oppressive quiet that had once defined Jed's existence. He found himself marveling at how quickly a house could become a home when it sheltered more than one person's ghosts. Amelia had recovered from her ordeal with the remarkable resilience of childhood, though the journey hadn't been without its challenges. She still had nightmares sometimes, waking with tears and reaching for the silver locket that held the family photograph. But these episodes grew less frequent as the weeks passed, replaced by a growing confidence and the kind of mischievous energy that belonged in a 7-year-old's daily routine. She'd grown 3 inches since coming to live with Jed, and the hollow look had disappeared from her cheeks as regular meals and security worked their healing magic. More importantly, she'd regained the sparkle of curiosity and mischief that belonged in a child's eyes. Her questions about everything from why horses needed shoes to how clouds stayed in the sky kept Jed constantly on his toes, forcing him to remember how to see the world through eyes that still found wonder in ordinary things. Tommy had blossomed. In the safety of the ranch, like a plant finally receiving adequate sunlight, his gentle nature, which his father had seen as weakness, proved to be a gift that touched everything around him. He could calm spooked horses with a word and a gentle hand, and his woodworking skills had produced everything from toy soldiers for Samuel to a jewelry box for Amelia, to a new handle for Jed's favorite hammer. But it was his capacity for forgiveness that amazed Jed most. The boy harbored no visible resentment toward his father, choosing instead to remember the few good moments they'd shared, the times Morrison had taught him to whittle, the stories he'd told around campfires, the rare occasions when his father's better nature had shown through the layers of bitterness and anger. "I think Papa was just lost," Tommy had explained one evening, while they worked together in the barn. "Sometimes people get so lost they can't find their way back to being good. But that doesn't mean they never were good, just that they forgot how." The wisdom in those words, coming from an 11-year-old boy who had every reason to hate his father, had brought tears to Jed's eyes and reminded him why protecting this child's gentle spirit was worth any sacrifice. Samuel remained the observer, but his silence had transformed from wariness to contentment. He'd appointed himself the family chronicler, writing detailed accounts of their daily life in a journal Jed had given him. His entries ranged from practical observations about ranch operations to thoughtful reflections on the nature of family and belonging. His keen intelligence had found outlet in helping Jed with ranch bookkeeping and in teaching himself to read by working through every book in Father Miguel's small library. At 9 years old, he was already showing signs of the kind of analytical mind that could build bridges between complex ideas, and Jed had begun discussing the possibility of sending him to the territorial university when he came of age. But perhaps, more importantly, Samuel had become the family's memory keeper, carefully preserving not just the facts of their daily life, but the emotional texture of their transformation from strangers into family. His journal entries captured moments that might otherwise be forgotten. The first time Amelia had called Jed Papa, the day Tommy had successfully broken a colt without help, the evening when all four of them had sat on the porch watching stars, and feeling, for the first time, like they truly belonged somewhere. The territory had indeed been transformed by Morrison's dying confession. Sheriff Davidson had acted on the information with remarkable efficiency, coordinating with lawmen across New Mexico to dismantle the criminal network Morrison had spent years building. 17 arrests had followed, along with the recovery of thousands of dollars in stolen money and goods that were returned to their rightful owners. The Hendricks Bank in Roswell remained unrobbed, its customers never knowing how close they'd come to tragedy. The Kelly family, with their 4 young children, continued their peaceful life, unaware that they'd been marked as potential victims in a scheme that died with its architect. Dozens of other families across the territory slept safer in their beds because of information provided by a dying outlaw's last act of conscience. The hidden stronghold near Lordsburg had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, maps, correspondence, detailed plans for future crimes that stretched months into the future. The tin box Morrison had mentioned contained enough documentation to solve crimes dating back years, bringing closure to families who had long ago given up hope of justice. Sheriff Davidson had traveled to Socorro personally to thank Jed for his role in dismantling the criminal network. He'd also brought news that several territorial banks had pooled resources to offer a substantial reward for Morrison's capture and the recovery of stolen funds. The money, more than Jed could have earned in 3 years of ranching, had gone toward expanding the ranch and securing the children's future. Cutter McKee, the one-eyed gunman Morrison had warned about, had indeed attempted to continue the vendetta. But his heart hadn't been in it, and when Sheriff Davidson's men tracked him to a hideout near Tucson, he'd surrendered without a fight. The threat that had haunted Jed's dreams for months had ended not with violence, but with the simple exhaustion of a man who'd discovered that some hatreds were too heavy to carry alone. During his interrogation, McKee had provided additional information about Morrison's network, filling in gaps that helped law enforcement complete their understanding of the criminal organization. He'd also revealed that Morrison had, in his final months, begun expressing doubts about the path he'd chosen, wondering aloud whether his quest for revenge had cost him more than it had gained. The changes in Jed himself were perhaps the most remarkable of all. The careful isolation he'd maintained for 7 years had given way to gradual re-engagement with the world beyond his ranch. He'd accepted Vicente's invitation to help plan the church's Christmas celebration, had offered his expertise to Sheriff Davidson on several cases, and had even begun attending the monthly town meetings where citizens discussed everything from road repairs to school funding. Doc Henderson had commented more than once on the transformation, noting that the permanent tension lines around Jed's eyes had softened and that he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had found his purpose again. "You're a different person," Henderson had observed during one of their checker games. "Still the same man underneath, but like someone lifted a weight you'd been carrying so long you forgot it was there." Vicente had been more direct in his assessment. "You smile now," he'd said simply. "Not all the time, but enough that people notice, and when you talk about the children, your whole face changes. That's what love does to a man. It makes him remember who he was before the world tried to break him. But it was the small, daily transformations that mattered most. The way he woke each morning to the sound of children's voices instead of silence. The way mealtimes had become conversations about dreams and fears and plans for the future rather than solitary exercises in basic nutrition. The way he'd learned to braid hair and tell bedtime stories and answer the 1,000 questions that curious children asked about everything from why the sky was blue to where people went when they died. He'd also learned to navigate the complex, emotional landscape of parenting children who had experienced trauma. There were days when Amelia retreated into herself, when Tommy's gentleness became withdrawal, when Samuel's observations turned dark with memories he couldn't yet process. On those days, Jed had learned to provide steady presence without forcing conversation, to offer comfort without demanding explanations, to trust that healing happened in its own time and couldn't be rushed. The community of Socorro had embraced the unusual family with characteristic frontier pragmatism. Children who needed homes were not uncommon in the territory, and men who stepped up to provide those homes were universally respected. Maria Santos had appointed herself unofficial advisor on child rearing, offering guidance on everything from treating childhood illnesses to managing behavioral challenges. Father Miguel had become a regular visitor, bringing books for the children and engaging in theological discussions with Samuel, whose precocious intelligence and endless questions about justice and morality had impressed the priest. "That boy will either become a great lawyer or a great criminal," Father Miguel had observed with a smile. "I'm betting on lawyer." The broader implications of their story had not gone unnoticed. Word of the children's rescue and Morrison's confession had spread throughout the territory, becoming the kind of tale that grew in the telling. But rather than focusing on the violence or adventure aspects, most versions emphasized the themes of redemption and family, the idea that broken people could heal together, and that love was stronger than vengeance. Several newspapers had requested interviews, but Jed had declined them all. This wasn't a story that needed to be sensationalized or turned into entertainment for distant readers. It was a private journey of healing that deserved to be protected from the glare of public attention. "Are you writing about us?" Amelia asked, appearing at his elbow as she always did when he was engaged in serious tasks. "I am," Jed replied, showing her the careful entries in the Bible. "This is how families remember who they are and where they came from." She studied the page with the intensity she brought to everything important. "Will you write about Mama Catherine? And baby Sarah too, so we know about them?" The question took his breath away, as Amelia's questions often did. But looking at her earnest face, seeing the genuine desire to honor the memory of people she'd never met, Jed felt something shift in his chest. Not the familiar ache of loss, but something warmer and more complex. "Yes," he said, turning to a fresh page. "I think it's time to write about them too." As he began to write about Catherine's laugh and Sarah's fearless spirit, the 3 children gathered around the table, adding their own memories and questions to the story. Tommy wanted to know if Sarah had liked horses as much as he did. Samuel asked thoughtful questions about what Catherine had been like as a teacher. Amelia wondered if they would have been friends if they'd met. The conversation that followed was unlike any Jed had experienced since Catherine's death, a genuine sharing of memory and emotion that honored the past while building bridges to the future. For the first time in 20 years, talking about his lost family didn't feel like reopening wounds, but like sharing treasures that became more valuable when they were appreciated by others. "Do you think they would have liked us?" Amelia asked with the directness that was her trademark. Jed considered the question seriously, imagining Catherine meeting these 3 remarkable children, picturing Sarah playing with kids who shared her curiosity and courage. "I think Catherine would have loved your questions and your determination to take care of your brothers. And Sarah, She would have taught you to whistle louder than any boy in the territory and probably gotten you into more trouble than I could handle." The children laughed at this, and the sound filled the kitchen with the kind of joy that had been absent from this house for far too long. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods Jed had planted that spring, and somewhere in the distance, Constance nickered softly to the new colt that had been born just 2 weeks ago. The broken pocket watch still sat in Jed's dresser drawer, its hands forever frozen at 11:47. But he'd stopped checking it obsessively, stopped using it as a reminder of his failures. Time, he was learning, wasn't about the moments that stopped. It was about all the moments that came after, the choices that built tomorrow from the ashes of yesterday. As winter approached and the family prepared for their first Christmas together, Jed found himself planning not just for the holiday, but for the years ahead. Tommy would need advanced instruction in woodworking and possibly an apprenticeship with a master craftsman when he reached the appropriate age. Samuel's intellectual gifts would require more formal education than Socorro could provide, which meant considering boarding school or eventually moving closer to the territorial university. Amelia would need guidance navigating the complex social expectations placed on young women in the territory, learning skills that would serve her whether she chose marriage or independence. But these were good problems, the kind that came from having a future worth planning for. They were the concerns of a man who had rediscovered hope and was willing to invest in tomorrow, despite the uncertainty it held. The evening ritual of reading aloud had become one of Jed's favorite parts of each day. Tonight, Samuel had chosen a passage from one of Father Miguel's donated books, a collection of stories about families who had overcome great hardships through mutual support and love. As Jed read by lamplight, with Amelia curled against his side and the boys listening intently from their chairs, he marveled at how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a man without purpose, counting days instead of building toward goals. Now he was part of something larger than himself, responsible for 3 young lives that depended on his wisdom, strength, and love. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead it felt liberating, a return to the sense of meaning that had driven him during his best years as a lawman. The children had brought more than just noise and activity to his life. They had restored his faith in the possibility of goodness, in the idea that people could change and grow and become better than their circumstances might suggest. Watching Tommy's gentleness transform from liability to strength, seeing Samuel's analytical mind grapple with complex moral questions, witnessing Amelia's courage in the face of loss and uncertainty, all of this had reminded Jed that resilience and hope were not naive fantasies, but practical tools for building a better world. The story of their rescue and Morrison's death had indeed become legend throughout the territory, but the version that mattered most was the one being written in their daily lives. This was a story about healing, about the way broken people could create something whole when they chose to trust each other. It was about the difference between justice and revenge, about the courage required to forgive without forgetting, and about the unexpected ways that love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. As Jed looked around the table at 3 children who called him family, he understood that some stories didn't end with justice or revenge or even forgiveness. The best stories, the ones worth telling, ended with hope, not the passive hope that waited for good things to happen, but the active hope that created good things through daily choices to love, protect, and believe in tomorrow. The family Bible lay open before them, its pages no longer empty, but filled with names and dates and the beginning of a new chapter in the continuing story of the Thornton family. Outside, the New Mexico stars shone with the same brilliance they had displayed for generations of families who had looked up at them and dreamed of better days ahead. Some broken things, Jed reflected as he watched his children's faces in the lamplight, could indeed be mended, Not restored to their original state, that was impossible, but transformed into something different and perhaps even stronger. Like his pocket watch with its frozen hands, some wounds became part of the story rather than the end of it. Reminders not of failure, but of the courage required to keep moving forward despite the pain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose love over fear. But tonight, in a kitchen filled with the quiet contentment of a family at peace, Jed Thornton understood that he had found something more valuable than justice, more healing than revenge, and more lasting than the temporary satisfaction of evening old scores. He had found home,